All right, we are back with a new video, and we kind of have an interesting topic to discuss today, and that is the top 10 players that were the most screwed over by a twist. And this was an interesting list for me to put together, just sort of thinking through the twists that come along in Survivor history. Now, for the sake of this list, I will not be including anyone who was swap screwed, as I feel like I could make a whole entire list based on just those people, although tri swaps are technically twists at the end of the day. And obviously, I will also not be including anyone that was idled out of the game, as idols are essentially part of the game, much like trad swats. And plus, I feel like that could be its own video itself. I'm mainly focusing on people who were screwed over by other twists in the game, whether they're format based or specific advantages that have come and gone over Survivor history. And I realize there will probably be some debate over who was screwed over by a twist or how much they were screwed over by a twist. And I understand that there will be some debate in that regard. Now, for this list, I will keep things relatively simple and focus on people who were taken out of the game as a direct result of, or in large part due to a twist, and players who probably would have done better had that twist not come into play at that specific moment. So even that will generate some debate. However, I feel like that will at least clear some things up and set some clear criteria for this list. Now, before we get into the actual top 10, I actually have a couple honorable mentions to go through. And surprisingly, most of these honorable mentions are from the modern era of the show and from relatively recent seasons, but that's just how it went down for me. First off, from Survivor Game Changers, we have Malcolm Freeberg, who was screwed over by the Joint Tribal Council that happened after the Tride Swap. And he was actually pretty close to making the list, and I seriously considered putting him at the number 10 spot. However, the main reason I decided to leave him out is I feel like there was more that Malcolm could have done to get himself out of that situation, as yes, he probably would not have been voted out had there not been a joint tribal there. And he does get unlucky that JT leaks the plan to the Nuku tribe about them targeting Sierra Dawn Thomas, allowing Ty to play his idol on her, and thus allowing Malcolm to go home. However, again, I feel like that is a largely standard vote out, and while it is unlucky of Malcolm, that had to happen at a joint tribal where people were incentivized to vote along original tribal lines. One, his tribe did have the numbers coming in, and two, I feel like this is the most standard vote out of anyone here, and because of that, I can't really say that he was as screwed over by the twist as some certain other people will be talking about soon. So because of that, I did decide to leave Malcolm off the list, although he was worthy of a mention. Next up, we have Dan Rendering from David vs. Goliath, who was screwed over by the Idol Nullifier, where he does attempt to save himself by playing an idol, only for it to be nullified by, well, the Idol Nullifier, which was obviously a brand new twist, and he had no way of knowing that that twist was even there. And he probably played a lot of that round with the assumption that he was going to be able to play his idol and that everything would be good, only for it to not be good. However, the reason I decided to leave him off the list as well is because he did already have the majority of the votes against him. And at the end of the day, it did feel like a largely standard vote out, with the Idol Nullifier basically allowing the majority and the rest of the game to play out as normal. And I even go as far as to say that had Dan been allowed to play his idol and Christian had gone home, who had the second most votes there, that Christian would have been more screwed over than Dan would have under the current circumstances. So because of that, I can't really consider Dan for this list. However, considering the fact that he was technically screwed over by the Idol Nullifier, he was at least worthy of a mention here. Next up, we have Jamal Shipman from IOI, and he was screwed over by the weird twist where he lost his vote simply by accepting the invitation to go to IOI, and him learning the lesson that you shouldn't just take things at face value, which is really stupid. And again, similar to these other people I mentioned, I feel like Jamal arguably had more to do with his own boot here, to where he was already in a pretty bad position after the Kelly vote out, where he was at the bottom there. He did vote to keep Kelly, and he was probably going to be targeted sooner rather than later anyway, had this twist not come into play. It's just that with him getting this twist and not being able to vote, that he was put in a much more tough position to actually survive that round. However, considering his poor position anyway, I can't really consider him too much, aside from the fact that the actual twist itself was really stupid. In the final honorable mention I'll include here is a bit of a weird one, but we have Lydia from Survivor 42. And Lydia is weird because on one hand, she was technically screwed over by the hourglass twist to where she probably would not have been voted out had the hourglass twist not come into play. And even beyond that, she would have stayed had Tori not won immunity. And through that, she became the default boot there. So that's not particularly great. However, she was also saved by a twist that happened earlier in the game. And we'll get into that a bit later, spoiler alert. However, she was technically supposed to go home at the first tribal of the season, or at least the first tribal that they attended. And had it not been for Mike's Beware advantage and Chanel losing her vote through Shipwheel Island, there is a good chance that Lydia is voted out anyway. So Lydia is weird because she does technically get screwed over by a twist. However, she also gets saved by a twist. So I feel like it all kind of equals out. And because of that, she isn't really on this list here. And with that, we are now moving on to the actual top 10. And admittedly, a lot of these lower entries are a bit debatable, as given their current game position at the time that they went home, I don't think they would have been particularly likely to win the game had they not been taken out where they were. Although I feel like they have a stronger case that they were taken out sooner than they probably would have had a certain twist not come into play, which is the big reason they are on the list here. So starting off at number 10, we have an interesting case to consider here, but from Survivor Panama, we do have Dan Barry, who was screwed over by the exile twist right before the merge, where if you don't remember, he was on the Lamina tribe. He was closely aligned with Terry for a lot of that pre-merge and was in a pretty good position there, with Sally being the one at the bottom and the one that they would have voted out had they gone to another tribal. However, after Kasaya won the reward and immunity challenge, they had the power to send one of the Lamina members to Exile Island, essentially giving that person immunity, and they ultimately chose to send Sally to Exile, the person that they were planning to vote off, which in turn caused Dan to be the default boot there. Had Sally not been sent to exile, and had Kasaya not been given that power, then Dan would not have been voted out there. And that's a big reason that he was screwed over by this twist. But I'll also say that even if this twist hadn't come into play, I'm not really sure that he wins the game per se, as he would have already been going to the merge down in numbers 4-6. And given that the Kasayas were planning to stick together at that point, especially after that reward challenge, I mean, it's very likely that Dan would have been one of the next couple boots there. Now, granted, I think he and Terry would have stayed over Nick and Austin there. However, once those two were gone, there's a good chance that Dan would have been the next one to go, especially with Terry going on his immunity run there. Now, sure, Terry could technically play the idol for Dan. However, I feel like Terry more than likely would have kept it for himself, and Dan would have been sent to the jury there. So at the end of the day, I don't think Dan would have been long for the game, even had he survived this round. However, I feel like compared to the honorable mentions, he was directly screwed over in the sense that he was taken out sooner thanks to a twist than he would have otherwise. So that's a big reason that he's on this list, and a big reason he is here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and similar to Dan, we have another person who probably would not have won the game had they not been taken out thanks to this twist. However, they probably would have made a couple rounds further. But here we have Xian from Survivor Thailand, who was screwed over by the fake merge. Now, Xian's interesting because she was obviously at the bottom of the Sukjai tribe for a lot of that pre-merge there, to the point where she was willing to flip come the merge, or at least what they thought was the merge. We obviously see her come over to the Chuigan members and immediately express her willingness to work with them to take off the remaining Sukjais there. And obviously it's not a great position, as she would have been at the bottom of the Chuigan alliance had she gone to vote with them, to the point where she would have been the first one out after all the other Sukjais have been voted out. However, had she been allowed to go down that path and had it been an actual merge, she would have at least made it to jury, and she probably would have outlasted most of the other Sukjais there. However, it came to light that it was a fake merge, and through that, they still had to compete as tribes there. And once Sukjai lost the immunity challenge, it was very obvious that Xian was going to be voted out there. Now, granted, Xian probably had a good chance of being voted out anyway, as again, she was at the bottom there. But with them assuming that a merge had already happened, it made it very obvious to them that she was going to flip and that there was no use in them keeping her around there. But it's still not great that the fake merge had to come into play there. But similar to Dan, I feel like Xian probably would not have won the game even if the twist hadn't happened. And obviously, even with the twist happening, and even if they knew about the full scope of the twist, she probably doesn't win the game anyway. But she, again, was taken out sooner than she would have had the twist not happened, which is a big reason that she is here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and these next two are pretty weird in the sense that I'm not too sure if they win the game had they survived this twist. My hunch is they probably don't. However, it isn't as black and white as it was with people like Dan or Sheehan, who were on seasons that were heavily dictated by tribal lines. However, it's still not looking great for either of them. But at number 8, we have someone from Island of the Idols. We have Jason Linden, who was screwed over by Elaine's block vote twist after the swap. And Jason's interesting because I actually think he was starting to pick up some momentum later in the game. He obviously had a very rough start at the beginning of the game. However, with him surviving some votes early on and him building some bonds with a lot of his fellow Vokai members, I feel like he was starting to gain some momentum in the game. And coming to the swap, he actually had the numbers to stay. Now, granted, it isn't great that the Lyros were planning to target him anyway. However, it didn't really matter because the Vokais had the numbers, and we saw even people like Aaron and Missy consider flipping with Tommy in order to vote with them. However, all that goes out the window once Elaine gets a block a vote advantage through her trip to IOI and her being able to retrieve it during the immunity challenge, which basically gives Aaron and Missy all the reason in the world to remain Lyro strong and in turn use that block a vote to block Jason's vote and send him out of the game. Now, obviously, had that block vote not happened, for one, the Vokais would have had the numbers outright, but they also would have had a decent chance of having Aaron and Missy on their side, giving them an even stronger advantage. So to that end, the block vote really screwed over Jason in a lot of regards there. And through that, he is decently higher than the people we just talked about. However, the main reason he isn't higher on the list is because it was still relatively early in the game. Like it's hard to really tell how Jason would have done beyond this. And plus with people like Tommy and Lauren really playing and dominating a lot of the game there and doing a lot of the work to get Aaron and Missy on the Vokai side to begin with, I'm not really sure how someone like a Jason would have navigated the game beyond that point, but it's still the potential for him to do well compared to people like Dan or Sheehan, who I feel like would have always been sitting ducks had that their particular twist not come into play. So it's because of that I do have Jason a bit higher, and he is here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and I actually consider putting this person below Jason given the circumstances surrounding their boot. However, I feel like this person, on paper at least, had less to do with why they were voted out, had less of a chance to respond to the twist that they were given, and also made it through quite a bit more votes than someone like a Jason. But here we have, from Survivor Cook Islands, Jenny Tucson Bay, who was screwed over by the bottle twist right before the merge, which if you don't remember, the bottle twist happened in the middle of Tribal. Rero had just voted out Rebecca, and they were asked to immediately vote someone else out without any deliberation, and as a result, they decided to vote out Jenny over someone like a Penner, who at that point was at the bottom of the tribe there. So Jenny gets really unlucky in the sense that she doesn't have any opportunity to strategize or to even consider a target. She just happens to be the fall person due to this twist here. And there's even some speculation that this twist was designed to give the I-24 a fighting chance coming into the merge, as obviously they had come into the mutiny a couple rounds earlier with a 4-8 disadvantage. They obviously won the last couple of challenges, and thanks to the Spala twist, they go from having a 4-6 deficit to merely a 4-5 deficit, in which all they had to do was flip one person at the merge in order for them to get the numbers, which, spoiler alert, they end up doing. So to that end, there is a bit of questionable production involvement in the implementation of this twist, but obviously Jenny ends up getting the receiving end of it and gets massively screwed over as a result. Now, similar to Jason, I don't really know if Jenny wins the game if this twist hadn't happened, as yes, she was on the Rero tribe, which would have had the majority at the merge even if this twist hadn't come into play. However, she wasn't really in the core of it, as I consider the core of the Rero group at that point to be Parvati, Adam, and Candace, and I feel like had the Reros been able to get the numbers and pick off a lot of the I2s, that Jenny would have been taken out along the way to the point where she doesn't win the game. So to that end, I can't really see Jenny winning the game anyway. However, it's through this twist that she was taken out much sooner than she probably would have, and she really had no way of responding to it or of saving herself here. So it's because of that I do have her a bit higher on this list, but not too high, and she's here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and I kind of alluded to this person earlier, but I'm talking about them here, and it's actually another Jenny. But here we have Jenny Kim from Survivor 42. And I believe this is the earliest boot that I have talked about on this list so far. And the reason for that is all the things that went wrong for Jenny to go home at this specific tribal. Now, obviously, it isn't great that Jenny comes into this tribal as the target of the minority in Hai and Lydia here. However, the thing is, had all 6 people on her tribe gone to vote, then she probably stays here with her and Mike, along with Daniel and Chanel, holding the numbers and voting out Lydia at this specific tribal. However, 2 things go wrong, and they both involve twists. One is that her closest ally, Mike, gets the Beware advantage, and with none of the other Beware advantages being activated at this point, that means that Mike doesn't have his vote there, so that by itself isn't great. And then also, earlier in this very round, Chanel had been sent to the summit where she got to either risk her vote and protect her vote. And if you saw my coverage of Survivor 42, you would probably know that Chanel made the wrong decision there in risking her vote when she really had no reason to do so. But through this, her side basically goes from having a 4-2 majority to a 2-2 tie coming into this, which is not a great look for her to begin with. However, none of this is necessarily her fault. It's largely due to other people being affected by twists that causes her side to lose the numbers here. And what we see thereafter is even after her side loses the majority, they still go to a tie and they still go to a deadlock. And we see Daniel and Hai go to a consensus debate over who to vote out here. And obviously Daniel completely drops the ball here and is completely willing to flip on Jenny at this point, which is the big reason that she goes home here. So really, while Jenny is the earliest boot on this list, and she literally is voted out at the first opportunity, she had the numbers to stay coming into this tribal based on the allies that were willing to vote with her. And it's through multiple things going wrong between Mike getting the Beware advantage, between Chanel choosing to risk her vote for seemingly no good reason, and Daniel just giving up at the first opportunity and completely throwing everyone under the bus that causes her to go home. And she ends up being the collateral damage of all this chaos that's happened here. So it's because of that I think Jenny gets massively screwed over here, and the main reason that she is on this list. However, the main reason she isn't higher is given how early she is taken out of the game. I talked about before how I think Jenny is actually not that bad of a player and definitely had a decent amount of potential coming into this season, to where had she survived this tribal, she probably would have done relatively well in the game. However, a lot of that is speculation at the end of the day, and I'm not too sure if she actually wins the game. Plus, given how early she's taken out, a lot of it would be speculation over how well she would have done had this twist not come into play. So it's because of that I can't really have her too much higher than here. However, I do think she still got massively screwed over by all these twists, and it's the main reason she is here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and I can see the debate for this person being higher, given the nature of the twist by which they got screwed over by. However, similar to some of these other people that I talked about earlier, I'm not entirely sure if this person does particularly well beyond this particular point had they not been screwed over, but they are still decently high on the list. But here we have Sydney from Survivor 41, and obviously she gets screwed over by the hourglass twist, which at the time was brand new. They had no idea that it was coming. In fact, Jeff straight up lied to the players after they had won the first challenge and saying that they had made the merge and that they were safe, only for him to blatantly backtrack later on, so that's not great. And given the way that the teams and the immunity challenge broke down, Sydney was really left in a pretty bad spot here, where she had Danny and Deshawn on her team, 2 of her closer allies, and obviously people that were not likely to be targeted there. You have Ricard, who ends up winning immunity there, and you have Evie, who was technically the target coming to the vote, but once Liana's knowledge is power failed, it made a lot of people think that the Yases were going to play the idol on Evie, which really made Sydney the default target there. But even beyond that, obviously, Sydney had the numbers to stay had she not used her shot in the dark, which, given the level of chaos that the tribal had created was a logical decision for her to make, where had she not played it, then obviously there would have been a tie between her and Evie. Evie would have gone home on the revote, and that would have been that. But given everything that happened and her using her shot in the dark, it made it so that there was this 5 to 4 to 3 vote split in which she ends up going home here. So obviously, a lot had to go wrong in order for her to go home here. And that is a big reason that she is this high on the list, in that she was someone who was technically in the majority coming into the merge and was in a decent spot there, even winning immunity in a spot where she was told that by winning that challenge, she was making it to the next round, only for that to be backtracked later on. And even after that, other things need to go wrong, like Ricard winning immunity and Evie's side successfully countering the knowledge is power, which made her the default target there. And of course, her using her shot in the dark, which lost her vote and really cost her the numbers there. But the main reason I don't have her higher is, well, one, she did technically doom herself by using her shot in the dark, so there is at least some responsibility there. And the other factor is that I don't really know if she wins the game if she survives this vote, to where, yes, she was in the majority at that point, but it was made pretty clear that she was one of the more expendable people in the majority. It was clear at that point in the game that they weren't willing to target someone like a Danny or someone like a Deshawn over her. And I feel like through that, City definitely would have been in some danger moving forward, depending on whether other people wanted to flip on the Luvu alliance at that point. And even if she had gotten to the end, I'm not too sure if she actually wins a jury vote. I mean, yes, there are people that liked her per se, but there are also people that really didn't like her. People like a Heather per se, that would have made it difficult for someone like her to get the respect of the jury. So it's really hard to say if she would have won the game or even gotten to the end had she not been screwed over. But at the end of the day, it's the fact that the hourglass twist came into play that caused her to go home much sooner than she would have otherwise. So it's because of that she is here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and this is where the list starts to get a bit more interesting, as I feel like these remaining players are all people who got screwed over by a twist in some way, in a spot to where they could have won the game had that twist not come into play. It's just a matter of how close they were to winning and how much the twist really screwed them over. But at number 4, we actually have the only person that was not voted out as a result of a twist, but was still screwed over by it nonetheless. And here we have Ozzy from Cook Islands, who was screwed over by the surprise Final 3 format of the season. Now, obviously, he played at a time where there had only ever been a Final 2, and it was assumed that this season would also be a Final 2. However, at the Final 4, it was revealed that this was the final immunity challenge and that 3 people would be getting to the end as opposed to just 2, which obviously puts Ozzy in a bad spot because Yule, his biggest jury threat at that point, was now basically guaranteed a spot at the final tribal as he had at the Super Idol, and through that he was allowed to play at the Final 4, basically guaranteeing him a spot in the Final 3 no matter what happened. Now, obviously, Ozzy wins immunity, and they agree to let Becky and Sundra battle it out in fire, and we obviously know how that turned out. But through this, Ozzy is now sitting at the end against Yule, and he ends up losing in a 5-4 jury vote there. So because of that, there is a strong argument that had there been a Final 2, and Ozzy had won that Final 3 immunity, which, given his track record on the season, is not out of the realm of possibility, that he votes out Yule, gets to the end against Becky, and more than likely wins in a 5-4 jury vote as well, or actually a 5-5 potentially. As while Ozzy would gain Adam's vote in a Ozzy-Becky Final 2, Becky would ultimately gain Yule's vote, and that would be a tie. So again, it's still a very wonky situation to consider. However, even then, it's not even a guarantee that Ozzy votes out Yule in this situation, as he's definitely someone who's talked about honor and wanting to go up against the best. And I know people have talked about this scenario in the past. So there is a chance that Ozzy takes Yule to the end anyway, which, I mean, Yule wins if that were to happen. So it's not a guarantee that Ozzy wins this scenario, even if it were a Final 2. However, considering that it was something that was unexpected, and there was at least a chance that Ozzy wins the game given the scenario, there is a debate for him being screwed over by this format change. And I know through that, people say that he was screwed over as a result, despite him not technically being voted out at any point. There's also the fact that Ozzy
had to win a whole bunch of immunities just to even get to this point, as he probably would have been the Final Four boot had he not won that Final Four immunity there. So there's also that to consider. So I can't really say Ozzy was the most screwed over out of anyone left here to talk about. However, it was the fact that this Final 3 format made it much more difficult for him to win than a Final 2 scenario, even though there aren't guarantees per se. But it's the fact that he comes closer to winning the game in the absence of a twist than anyone we already mentioned on this list. That leads me to put him here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and this person was definitely taken out of the game much sooner than someone like an Ozzy and had their chances of winning snuff sooner because of his twist. However, unlike some other people I talked about earlier in this list who were screwed over by twists earlier in the game, I actually think this person had a solid shot of winning the game. Now, it's not a guarantee, but the possibility was there. But here we have Andrew Savage from Survivor Pearl Islands, who was screwed over by the Outcast twist on that season, to where he had come into the merge tied in numbers with his original tribe. He was the leader of the Morgan tribe at that point. However, we got the Outcast twist where, because the Outcast tribe ends up winning the challenge, 2 people end up coming back into the game, one of who is Lil, who was one of the earlier boots from the Morgan tribe and who was very much a social outcast on that tribe. So obviously her coming back into the game in a spot where the original tribes are tied in numbers and are playing to sit together for those early votes, Lil was very much incentivized to flip against the Morgans and vote with the Drakes in that situation. And with Andrew Savage being the leader and the main source of Lil being an outcast early on in the pre-merge, she obviously decides to target him. And through that, the Drakes end up getting the numbers to vote out Andrew Savage there at the merge. So because of that, Andrew Savage does get screwed over. Like, had the Outcast host not come into play, had Lil specifically not come back into the game, like there's a good chance that Andrew Savage is not voted out with the number margins there. Now, granted, it's still not a great spot as they are still tied in numbers at that point, and they would need to flip over one of the Drakes in order to get the numbers there. However, with the Outcast twist, it basically guaranteed that the Morgans were coming into that vote down in numbers, with Lil basically having zero reason to work with them for that specific vote. And with Savage being the out in front leader and the biggest threat, he really had nowhere to hide in that situation. So because of that, I do think he got massively screwed over here in a spot to where, had the Morgans somehow gotten the numbers and had stuck together and gotten it down to their remaining Morgans, I do think there's a decent shot that he wins the game. Now, granted, he still might have been targeted due to being a big threat regardless. However, had he gone to the final 2 against like some of the other Morgans there, I do think there's a decent shot that he wins a jury vote there, as he was well respected out there, and he was playing a pretty solid game up to that point. So I do think Andrew Savage definitely had a chance of winning the game had he not, again, been voted out at the spot that he did. And yes, while it isn't a guarantee that he survives the vote without the twist, it's the fact that the twist happened, which basically made it much more difficult for him to get out of that situation, which leads me to believe that he was screwed over by the twist. So because of that, I do consider Savage to be one of the more screwed over players at the end of the day, thanks to a twist. However, I do think there are 2 other players who definitely had a much more clear shot of winning the game had their specific twist not come into play. That does lead me to leave Savage here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and we're going back now to the end game. And these are 2 of the more notable people that have gotten screwed over by format changes that result in them losing the game before the end. So obviously it's a matter of the order here. But at number 2, I decided to go with Devin Pinto from Survivor HHH, who was obviously screwed over by the forced fire making twist. Now, similar to the Final 3 format with Ozzy, the Final 4 here had no idea that forced fire making was going to happen. They were obviously planning to target Ben at the Final 4, and once Ben lost immunity, that should have been it. However, they end up getting the twist. They get announced that there was going to be this forced fire making twist where they would have to send 2 people to fire, with obviously Ben being one of them. It's just a matter of picking the other person there. And through that, Chrissy ends up picking Devin to go in that spot as he had the best chance of beating Ben in there, but obviously ends up coming up short. Ends up beating him in fire making, and Devin is taken out of the game 1 day short of Final Tribal. And the reason I have Ben this high is he obviously had a decent shot of winning the game, and he had played the game in a way to where the Final Four would have been a traditional vote, as every other season beforehand had been. And had he gone to the Final Three against Chrissy and Ryan, I mean, it's not a guarantee that he wins that jury vote, but I feel like he definitely would have had a shot per se, as I feel like anyone could have won that Final Three depending on how that final tribal would have went. And obviously, had that twist not come into play, Devin would have had that opportunity to explain his game and potentially get those jury votes on his side. But through this fire making twist, he ends up having to deal with this additional challenge and ends up getting taken out as a result. So he definitely gets massively screwed over in that he is someone who potentially could have won the game and actually had a better shot of winning the game than someone like an Ozzy, whose jury chances were a bit more suspect. However, was taken out of the game due to this twist. However, the main reason he is at number one on this list is one, I mean, he still had agency within the twist. Like, he still could have actually beaten Ben in the fire making challenge. He just simply wasn't able to. And also, I mean, it's not a guarantee that he wins the jury vote either, even if he got into the end. Again, he would have had to really fight for those jury votes against someone like Chrissy and Ryan, two people that played pretty strong games in their own right. So because of that, I can't have him at number one. However, the fact that he was still pretty close to winning the game compared to all these other people, and the fact that he had played the game in a way to where this twist really threw a wrench in his plans that causes him to be here at number two. And now, at number one, the player I believe got the most screwed over by a twist is Suri Fields from Survivor Micronesia with the surprise final two. And obviously, there's a lot going on here. I mean, the biggest of which is that the final two format of the season wasn't even planned from the beginning. I mean, with all the other twists that I mentioned and all the other people that got screwed over, yes, they got screwed over. However, at least those twists were planned from earlier on the season. Well, I mean, ball twist, potentially not so, but all the other twists were arguably planned out from earlier on the season and were planned to be revealed sooner or later. Whereas the final two wasn't even supposed to happen, as the season was supposed to be a final three as the last couple seasons had been. However, it was due to medevacs, particularly the James medevac at the final seven, that caused production to have to create an extra day in the schedule that led to them creating this final two format in order to create an extra round. So because of that, I mean, that really screws up a lot of Suri's endgame plans, as she had really played this entire game as a final three. She had planned to go to the end against Amanda and Parvati, as those are people that she could beat in a jury vote. And based on what we know now from the jury, there's a good chance that she would have won against Amanda and Parvati. Now, granted, it would have been close, as it probably would have been a 3-2 vote. However, Suri does probably edge it out at the end of the day. And had the season been a final two, I mean, there's a good chance that Suri would have played the game much differently, as it would have been very dangerous for her to go into the final three against Amanda and Parvati in a spot where there is still another round of the game to be played. So because of that, Suri really got screwed over here in the sense that she played the game in a way that should have won her the game, but due to outside circumstances like James getting medevac that caused production to change the end game at the last minute to make it a final two. And at that point, I mean, Suri didn't really have much of a chance. She basically needed to win that final immunity. And given how that final immunity was really not in her wheelhouse, I mean, she was basically a goner at that point. So obviously, Suri is someone who got massively screwed over by a twist, and particularly a twist that wasn't even supposed to happen coming into the season. And compared to all the other people we just talked about, Suri has a pretty blatant win scenario had this twist not happened. And now again, it is still a close jury vote, and who knows how Final Tribal would have gone there. However, it's the fact that she had the most clear chance of winning a jury vote compared to someone like a Devin or an Ozzy that makes her the clear favorite to win compared to all these other people. And the twist directly got in the way of that by making it so that she was the biggest threat coming into that final three round. And given the challenge that she had very little shot of winning, it made it so that she essentially had no shot of winning the game despite those odds. So because of that, I feel like Suri still got massively screwed over at the end of the day. And I'm sure a lot of people were expecting her to be this high on the list, as Suri did play this great game, a winning game per se, but one that got cut off short by a twist. So because of that, Suri is the most screwed over player by a twist, and the reason she is here number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now I do have other videos like this planned in the future, so stay tuned for that. We got Big Brother 24 and Survivor SA coming up soon, so stay tuned for coverage for that. And also, as a bit of an announcement, I am creating a Discord server. So, I mean, you guys can feel free to join that. I mean, we can talk about other shows that I cover on this channel as well as my other channels. So, like there's a spot for that. So I did provide a link in the description so you guys can check it out if you like. So that is something I am doing. So, like that is something at least. But for now, that is the video. See ya.